Hello and welcome to Unacademy's Let's Crack UPSC CSC English channel. I am Rajshekar Reddy, faculty for Current Affairs. Before starting today's lecture, I would like to tell something about myself. I have cleared the civil service examination in 2014 and I have 7 years of experience teaching current affairs, polity and international relations. I am a BTech Computer Science graduate from JNTU Hyderabad. You need to download the Unacademy Learning app, and by downloading and subscribing to the Unacademy Learning app, you get a number of advantages. So these advantages include daily live classes. So you have live classes on a daily basis wherein you can chat with your educator, ask questions, engage in discussions, and answer polls. So you can carry out a number of activities during the class. So all these can be done during the live class. The courses that are available on the Unacademy Learning app, unlike the courses on YouTube or any other free platform. So the courses that are available on the Unacademy Learning app are structured in nature. So they deal comprehensively with the syllabus of the civil service examination. So they comprehensively deal with the civil services syllabus. Then we have a number of educators taking live tests and quizzes on a regular basis. So you have a very good advantage of these live tests and quizzes in clearing the civil service examination. And most importantly, you have unlimited access to content on the Unacademy Learning app. You can watch these videos any number of times without any limitation. And you can watch from the comfort of any of your devices. India's best educators are teaching on the Unacademy platform. So you have Sudarshan Gurjar, Mrunal Patel, Prakash Kumar, and others who teach on this platform. So you have access to the best coaching facilities on the Unacademy Learning app. You also have a number of courses designed by various faculty members which comprehensively deal with a particular subject. You need to subscribe to the Unacademy Learning app. There are a number of subscription options available. So you can subscribe for 1 month, you can subscribe for 3 months, you can subscribe for 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months. The 24-month subscription option is the best option because it gives you a 67% discount. So you get a 67% discount by subscribing for 24 months. You can get an additional 10% discount if you use my code RRUPSC. So please use this code RRUPSC while subscribing to the Unacademy Learning app. So you'll get an additional discount of 10%, and the final transaction cost will be 57,600, and you can convert these transactions into no cost EMIs which can be extended up to 24 months. So the coaching fee at Unacademy is relatively cheap compared to the other offline coaching institutions. You can compare the fees here with any other offline coaching institution. You can clearly understand that Unacademy is the cheapest and the best platform for online civil services education. So let us start today's lectures. As you all know, I have started a series called Top 200 Topics in Current Affairs for Civil Services Prelims 2020. We have already finished 50 topics in the past 9 lectures, and we will be dealing with the following set of 10 topics in today's lecture. So this lecture is lecture number 10. So I request you to please go through all the previous lectures for the remaining 50 topics that we have finished. So in this lecture, we will be looking at the following 10 topics. These topics include Bodoland Peace Agreement. A very important peace agreement was signed to promote peace in Bodoland region. So Bodoland Peace Agreement will be discussed in today's class. We will also discuss the procedure by which communities are given SC/ST status by the government of India. Recently, a couple of communities were granted scheduled tribe status from Karnataka. So we will look at that issue. Private members bill. Some members of the parliament have introduced private members bills recently. Some of them are very controversial. So we will look at the procedure by which private members bills can be introduced and passed in the parliament. We will also look at a very important organization called GST Council. GST Council is very important for your exam. Then there is a committee of the United Nations Security Council called the United Nations Security Council 1267 Committee. Recently, some people have been designated as global terrorists under the United Nations Security Council 1267 Committee. So we will look at the procedure and various aspects related to UNSC 1267 Committee. Then we have the Financial Action Task Force, which is always in the news. We come across FATF while dealing with Pakistan. So Pakistan is already in the grey list of the FATF. we want Pakistan to be included in the blacklist. Then there is a very important peace deal which was signed recently between the government of the United States of America and the Taliban. So we will look at the salient features of the Afghanistan peace deal. This is a very important topic, not just for the prelims but also for the mains examination. The best institutions of our country are ranked by the Ministry of HRD in the NIRF rankings, so National Institutional Framework rankings. Then we will also look at the World University rankings, QS World University rankings, and S&P ratings, so Standard and Poor ratings given to India. So these are the 10 topics which will be dealt in today's class. So if you have any doubts, you can contact me at this number 76739399090. You can also follow me on my Telegram channel. I am here writing the Telegram channel name. So Rajashekara Rendi UPS. So this is the name of the channel. So you can join this channel for having access to the material. So if you want the PDF content, then you can get this content on this channel. So let us start with the first topic for today's class. The first topic for today's class is Bodoland Peace Agreement. So first of all, you must know what is Bodoland, and before that you must know who are the Bodos, what do they want, and what is the present agreement. What is the present agreement which was signed? So Bodos. So first you must know where the Bodos inhabit. So Bodos are the single largest community among the notified scheduled tribes in Assam. So they are a scheduled tribe community present in the state of Assam, and they are forming part of a larger umbrella group called Bodo Kachari group. So part of the larger umbrella of Bodo Kachari, the Bodos constitute nearly 5 to 6% of the population of Assam. So Bodos are the single largest community among the notified scheduled tribes in Assam. So they are an ST tribe in Assam, and they are concentrated primarily in 4 districts of Assam. And what is that they want? So they want a separate state from themselves. So they want statehood. So they have been demanding for a separate state for the Bodo regions since 1967. However, this demand of a separate state for Bodoland has not been accepted by the central government. 3 attempts have been made, and the third and the last attempt was announced very recently this year. So in 2020, the government of India signed an agreement with the Bodo leaders, and according to the government of India, this is the final and comprehensive solution to the Bodo dispute. So let us see what the government of India has done. So with an aim to bring permanent peace in Bodo dominated areas in Assam, the centre signed a tripartite agreement with the dreaded insurgent group National Democratic Front of Bodoland and 2 other outfits, namely the All Bodo Student Union and the United Bodos People's Organization. So with an aim to bring peace in the Bodo dominated areas. So this is the purpose with which the agreement has been signed. So with an aim to bring peace or permanent peace to Bodo dominated areas in Assam, the centre signed a tripartite agreement. So tripartite agreement involves 3 parties. So who are these 3 parties? One party is the central government, and the other party is the state government, and the third parties include all the Bodo groups. So all Bodo groups have been taken on board by signing this agreement. So in order to bring peace in Bodo dominated areas, the centre has recently signed a tripartite agreement with the dreaded insurgent group, that is the National Demographic Front of Bodoland and other outfits of the Bodo agitation. So in the presence of the Union Home Minister, the tripartite agreement. So this agreement aims at providing political and economic benefits without acceding to the demand for a separate state or union territory. So this agreement promises political benefits as well as economic benefits, but it does not grant statehood for Bodoland region. So this is something which is important. This is an agreement which provides political and economic benefits without acceding to the demand for statehood or union territory. In the presence of Union Home Minister, the tripartite agreement was signed by the leaders of 4 National Democratic Front of Bodoland, the All Bodo Student Union, and the United Bodos People's Organization. So it has taken, this agreement has brought all Bodo representatives on board, and they also included, this agreement also included representatives from the central government and the state government. So Union Home Minister said that this agreement is a final and comprehensive solution to the demand of the Bodos while retaining the territorial integrity of Assam. So while signing this agreement, the Union Home Minister has stated that this is a final and comprehensive solution to the demand that is made by the Bodos. And this agreement retains the territorial integrity of Assam. So it will not divide Assam into two parts. So it will retain the territorial integrity of Assam. So the territorial integrity of Assam has been protected by this agreement. So as I have told you, Bodos are a scheduled tribe concentrated in some four districts of Assam. They are the largest scheduled tribe of Assam and they have launched an agitation for separate state since 1967. So you can see this map. So this is the map where the Bodos are concentrated. So Assam is the state where we see Bodos and they are primarily found in four districts of Assam, that is Kokrajhar, Chirang, Udalguri and Baksa. So these are the places where we see the Bodos, and these are the areas which must be created as a separate state according to the Bodo outfits, but this has not been accepted recently by the government of India. So as I've told you, Bodos are the single largest community, tribal community of Assam, and they have organized a demand. The first organized demand for a Bodo state came in the year 1967-68. So they started agitating for a separate state of Bodoland since 1967-68. So this agitation is more than 50 years old under the banner Plains Tribal Council of Assam. So this is the political party which started uh, demanding a separate state for Bodoland. So this party is called Plains Tribal Council of Assam. In 1985, you must have come across this when you study polity or post-independent history of India. So in 1985, when the Assam movement culminated in the Assam Accord, many Bodos felt it was essentially focusing on the interests of the Assamese-speaking community. So the Assam Accord was signed by the central government, state government. It basically was signed to protect the demographic composition of Assam. So it actually identified a particular date as the date for granting citizenship. So this agreement, which was signed, sidelined the Bodos. That is what the Bodos feel, and they have revived the agitation for the creation of Bodoland in the year 1987. So in 1985, when the Assam movement culminated in the Assam Accord, many Bodos saw it as essentially focusing on the interests of the Assamese-speaking community. In 1987, the All Bodo Student Union, led by Upendranath Brahma, revived the Bodo statehood demand. So again, so this demand was initiated in the year 1967, but it was dormant. Again, it was revived in 1987 by Upendranath Brahma, and there was an armed group which was created, which was called Bodo Security Force under the leadership of Ranjan Dayamari. So Ranjan Dayamari created the Bodo Security Force, and this later became the National Democratic Front of Bodoland or Boroland, and it later split into several factions. And as of now, we have four factions of this group. So the National Democratic Front of Boroland is the armed group which is agitating for the creation of Boroland. In fact, we should be happy that they have also been brought on board while signing the agreement. As I've told you, these are the areas where Bodos are concentrated. So since 1987, so this agitation, as I've told you, became serious since 1987. So since 1987, Bodo groups have fought often violently. So there is a lot of violence involved in this agitation. So Bodo groups have fought often violently for a separate state called Bodoland to be carved out of Assam as a designated homeland for the community. So Bodoland must be created out of Assam, and this is the demand made by the Bodo groups since 1987. More than 4,000 people have been killed in the Bodo armed insurgency. So till date, more than 4,000 people have been killed in this insurgency movement. So this is unfortunate. So in the process, or over the past 33 years, we have seen more than 4,000 getting killed in this agitation. So, however, this is not the first time that an agreement was reached with the leaders of the Bodo groups. The first agreement was reached in the year 1993. So, the first agreement was signed in the year 1993, and this resulted in the creation of Bodoland Autonomous Council. Bodoland Autonomous Council was created way back in the year 1993. However, this could not satisfy the aspirations of the people, so they started the agitation once again. So now the second agreement was signed in the year 2003, and this resulted in the creation of BTAD, Bodoland Territorial Area District, which was administered by Bodo Territorial Council. So on February 10, 2003, the Assam Government Center and the Bodoland Liberation Tigers or Bodo Liberation Tigers signed a memorandum of settlement to form the present Bodo Territorial Council, which includes Kokrajhar, Chirang, Baksa, and Udalgiri districts. However, the Bodos claimed that the accord did not fulfill their demands, and an armed movement for a separate Bodoland began. So again, many people were not satisfied. They started the agitation again with the latest agreement. So the first agreement for resolving the border dispute was signed in 1993. The second agreement was signed in 2003. The first agreement created what is called Bodoland Autonomous Council. The second agreement created an area called Bodoland Territorial Area District, and this was administered by the Bodoland Territorial Council. And the final agreement, that is the last agreement, was signed very recently, that is 2020. And this agreement has also not accepted the statehood demand, but it has promised a number of legislative, economic, and judicial benefits to this region. So, with the latest agreement, over 1,500 armed cadres will abjure violence and join the mainstream. So, many armed cadres have uh, stated that they will be abjuring violence. A special development package of 1,500 crores over the next 3 years will be implemented by the union government, which involves taking up a number of different projects. So this is a very very important agreement which aims at promoting peace in the region. So what are the salient features of this agreement? So these are the two important features. On the one hand, the Bodo armed groups have agreed to abjure violence and give up arms. On the other hand, the central government has committed itself to a 1,500 crore package over the next 3 years, and this package involves taking up a number of projects. So the detailed provisions of this agreement are as follows. So the Bodoland Territorial Area District in Assam will be redrawn and renamed as Bodoland Territorial Region. So this is the first and the most important point. BTAD, which has been constituted under the 6th schedule of the Constitution of India, will be renamed as BTR, that is Bodoland Territorial Region. So Bodoland Territorial Area District in Assam will be redrawn and renamed as Bodoland Territorial Region. Currently, it spreads over 4 districts in the state of Assam. The agreement provides for more legislative, executive, and administrative, administrative, and financial powers to Bodo Territorial Council, and amendments to the 6th schedule of the Constitution to improve financial resources and administrative powers of the Bodoland Territorial Council. So this agreement not just creates the Bodo Territorial Region, it also grants them more executive power, legislative power, and financial powers. And the 6th schedule of the Constitution of India will be amended or will be changed to incorporate these benefits. Villages that are dominated by Bodos that are outside, villages dominated by Bodos that are outside the Bodo territorial area district will be included, and those with non-Bodo population will be excluded from the Bodo territorial region. So those villages which have a significant Bodo population will be included in Bodo territorial region, and those without a Bodo population will be excluded from the BTR. Bodos living in the hills will be conferred ST status. So Bodos living in the hills will be conferred ST status, that is Scheduled Tribe Hill status. And central government will be providing a 1,500 crore package over the next 3 years for the development of Bodo areas. Armed cadres of organizations such as National Democratic Front of Bodoland will be rehabilitated and mainstream. So those who give up arms will be rehabilitated into the mainstream. They will be provided with various opportunities for development. Then the government of Assam will notify Bodo language in Devanagari script as the associate language, associate official language in the state. So Bodo language will be recognized as the associate language along with Assamese. Then representatives of the Bodo community will be increased in state, police, and paramilitary forces. This is also very important. So there will be greater representation of the Bodos in the state, police, and paramilitary forces. A commission will be set up to look into the progress of the implementation of this particular agreement. So this commission will be set up under section 14 of the 6th schedule of the Constitution of India. Then institutions such as Central University, Sports University, medical colleges will be set up in this region. This agreement empowers the Bodoland Territorial Council to have a say in the appointment of deputy commissioners or collectors and superintendents of police, although the home and police departments will continue to be with the state government. So, this agreement, which has been signed, empowers the Bodo Territorial Council, which administers the Bodo Territorial region, to have a say in the appointment of collectors and SPs in that region, though the home and the police department will continue to remain with the state government. So these are the salient features. So I just go through these again. So Bodo Territorial Region will be constituted. This Bodo Territorial Region will be given more powers: legislative, executive, administrative, and financial powers. Villages that have a significant Bodo population will be included in the Bodo Territorial Region, and those which do not have Bodo population will be excluded from the BTR. Bodos living in the hill regions will be granted ST hill tribe status. Then central government has announced a 1500 crore package over the next 3 years for the Bodo areas. Armed cadres of organizations like NDFB will be rehabilitated and mainstream. Government of Assam will notify Bodo as the associate official language of Assam. Representation of the Bodo community will be increased in the state police and paramilitary forces. A commission will be established under Section 14 of the 6th Schedule to the Constitution of India to ensure that the agreement is being implemented in true spirit. Institutions such as the Central University, Sports University, medical colleges will be set up in the region. The agreement empowers the Bodo Territorial Council to have a say in the appointment of deputy commissioners and superintendents of police. So this is a very good agreement which has been signed. However, there are certain limitations to this agreement. So what are the apprehensions that are expressed by others? So what are the limitations of this agreement? So this is a very good agreement as far as I am concerned. This is a promising development that has taken place in Bodo regions. But there are two apprehensions that are brought about. So the first is the augmented area and powers of the Bodo Territorial Council under the new accord may trigger fresh aspirations in 9 autonomous councils in Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram to graduate to a new model. So under this agreement, the Bodo Territorial Council has been given greater powers. And there are several other, so there are 9 more autonomous councils created under the 6th schedule. And these councils are spread over 4 states: Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. So they may also start demanding more powers from the central government. So the augmented area and powers of the Bodoland Territorial Council under the new accord may trigger fresh aspirations in the 9 autonomous councils in Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram to graduate to the new model. This is likely to have an impact on the existing power sharing arrangements between the governments and the autonomous councils constituted under the 6th schedule in these states. So there might be a disturbance in the power balance between the autonomous councils and the governments in the other parts of Assam as well as the 3 other states under the 6th schedule. Then the peace accord has brought the curtains down on over 3 decades of insurgency in Bodoland, which is critical for the return of peace in the Bodo heartland. So this is a very important agreement which aims at bringing peace in the Bodo heartland region. However, the opposition to the accord voiced by organizations of non-Bodo communities. So there are several non-Bodo communities living in the Bodoland region, and these people include Koch, Raj, Bangshis, Adivasis and religious and linguistic minorities. They have expressed fears that if their grievances are not addressed, so if the grievances of the non-Bodo communities are not addressed, then the ethnic fault lines in Assam will deepen. So then there will be an increasing gap between the ethnic communities in Assam. So on the one hand, by giving more powers to the Bodo Territorial Council, the center has ignited similar demands, or they may be similar demands from the other territorial councils constituted under Schedule 6. Similarly, the peace accord, which has brought curtain down on over 3 decades of insurgency, may also not satisfy the non-Bodo communities inhabiting the Bodo regions. And if these grievances are not heard, then there might be an increase in the gap between the Bodos and the non-Bodos inhabiting the Bodoland region. So these are the two concerns that are expressed by experts. So this is about the Bodoland issue. This is a very important topic for your examination. So you must know what is Bodoland and the various aspects related to the Bodoland issue. Then we will move on to the next topic called scheduled tribes. So there are a number of communities which are called scheduled tribes in India. This is a very small topic, so we will not be dealing with the distribution of scheduled tribes and various aspects related to scheduled tribes. But we will just look into the procedure by which communities are given ST status by the government of India or the parliament. So this is in the news because Parliament recently passed a bill to amend the Constitution Scheduled Tribes Order 1950 to include three tribes, namely Parivara, Talavara, and the Siddhi community of Dharwad and Belagavi district, in the list of scheduled tribes in Karnataka. So very recently, the government, that is the Parliament, has amended an order called Constitution ST Order 1950. So this is the order which has all the scheduled tribes. So the scheduled tribes in various states are mentioned in this order, and this has been modified recently, and the Parliament has given approval for the addition of Parivara, Talavara, and Siddhi. Siddhi community earlier was also given ST status, but Siddhi community, people belonging to Siddhi community inhabiting the Uttara Kannada district alone enjoyed the ST status. But the Siddhi community of Dharwad and Belagavi districts did not enjoy ST status. But now, Siddhi community inhabiting Dharwad, Belagavi, and Uttara Kannada district will be given ST status. So, Parliament has recently passed a bill which amends Constitution ST Order 1950 to include three tribes, namely Parivara, Talavara, and Siddhi community of Dharwad and Belagavi districts in the list of scheduled tribes in Karnataka. Currently, the Siddhi tribe of Uttara Kannada district alone is included in the list. Scheduled tribes are classified as marginal communities on the basis of geographical isolation. So, just scheduled tribes are marginalized communities. So, they are backward communities and they are classified as such on the basis of geographical isolation. So, they don't mingle freely with the other communities and they live in isolation. Usually, they inhabit the forest regions of the country. So, scheduled tribes are classified as marginalized communities on the basis of geographical isolation. So, what are the factors that are taken into consideration before declaring a community as an ST community? So, these are the factors which are identified by the National Commission of Scheduled Tribes. So, primitiveness, geographical isolation, shyness, social, educational, and economic backwardness are the traits that are taken into consideration while declaring any community as ST community. So, primitiveness, geographical isolation, shyness, social, educational, and economic backwardness are the traits which are taken into consideration before declaring a community as a scheduled tribe community. What does the Constitution of India say? Does it define scheduled tribes? The Constitution of India defines, or it in one way defines scheduled tribes under Article 366. This is something important. So, scheduled tribes are defined under Article 366, Clause 25 of the Constitution of India. So, what does Article 366, Clause 25 say? So, scheduled tribes have been defined in Clause 25 of Article 366 of the Constitution as such tribes. So, as such tribes or tribal communities or parts of or groups within such tribes or tribal communities as are deemed under Article 342 the scheduled to be scheduled tribes for the purposes of the Constitution. So they have actually not defined who are scheduled tribes. They just said that those tribes or tribal communities which are deemed as scheduled tribes under Article 342 are called scheduled tribes. So scheduled tribes have been defined in Clause 25 of Article 366 of the Constitution as such tribes or tribal communities or parts of or groups within such tribes or tribal communities as are deemed under 342. Then what does 342 say? So 342 of the Constitution of India says that the President may, with respect to any state or union territory and where it is a state, after consultation with the governor thereof, by public notification, specify the tribes or tribal communities or parts of or group within a tribe or tribal communities which shall, for the purposes of this Constitution, be deemed as scheduled tribes in relation to that state or union territory as the case may be. So this is a lengthy provision. So you must simply remember that the President of India in consultation with the governor, has the power to designate any tribe as a scheduled tribe in that state. So a tribe which has been declared as a scheduled tribe in a particular state need not be a scheduled tribe in other state. So the President of India, in consultation with the governor of a state, specify the tribes or tribal communities or parts or groups within the tribes or tribal communities which shall, for the purposes of this constitution, be deemed as scheduled tribes. So this is something important. However, the president's role is only in the initiation of the list. The later modifications are done by the parliament. So parliament may by law include in or exclude from the list of scheduled tribes specified in a notification issued under clause 1 any tribe or tribal community or part or group within any tribe or tribal community, but save as aforesaid, a notification issued under the said clause shall not be varied by any subsequent notification. So initially the president shall release the list of scheduled tribes in various states, and that is the end of the role of the president. After this list is released by the President of India, modifications to this list, that is inclusions or exclusions into that list, can be made only by the parliament. So this is something which is confusing and interesting. So who has the power to declare any particular tribe as a scheduled tribe? So the initial list will be released by the President of India, but that brings the end of the role of the President of India. Subsequent modifications are made by the parliament. So you can see here the first specification of scheduled tribes in relation to a particular state or union territory is by a notified order of the president after consultation with the state government union territory concerned. So the first specification, this is the important, the first specification will be made by the President of India in consultation with the state government, that is the governor or governor on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Any subsequent inclusion, this is very important. So any subsequent inclusion or exclusion from, so inclusion in or exclusion from, and other modifications in the list of scheduled tribes can be made only through an amending act of parliament. So subsequent modifications can be done only through amending this constitution scheduled tribes order. So as we have seen here, so the Parliament of India has the power to make changes to this order. So this order was given by the President of India way back in the year 1950, and subsequent changes to this order cannot be made by the President, it can be made only by the Parliament. So very recently the Parliament has decided to grant ST status, that is they have decided to include 3 more communities to this list. They are Parivara, Talavara and Siddhi community. So this is something which you need to know. In prelims there might be such questions. So as I've told you, the President released the first constitutional ST order in the year 1950. Similarly, the SC order has also been released in the year 1950. So Constitution SC order was also released in 1950. This order has the list of scheduled castes, and modifications into that list is also done by the Parliament. Similarly, the ST order was also released in 1950. And you have to remember one more point, as far as scheduled castes are concerned, scheduled castes need not be followers of a single religion, that is Hinduism. So many people are of the assumption that scheduled castes are prevalent only in the Hindu religion. This is not the case. Scheduled castes are recognized even in Buddhist religion and Sikh religion. So, but however, Christians are not deemed to be part of scheduled caste. So you must remember that according to this order, that is the Constitution Scheduled Caste Order, no person who professes a religion different from the Hindu, Sikh or the Buddhist religion shall be deemed to be a member of the scheduled caste. This is very important. So any person who professes a religion different from Hindu, Sikh or Buddhist religion shall be deemed to be a member of scheduled caste. So this is something which is important and you need to note this. So this is a very important topic for the prelims examination. Okay, let us continue the class. The next topic for today's class will be private members too. So this is a very small topic but important for the prelims examination. So in this topic you need to know some essential features of a private members bill. So you must know who is a private member, what are the features of a bill introduced by a private member, and what are the various other issues that affect a private members bill. First of all, I would like to give you an example. So in the month of November 2019, a BJP member from the Lok Sabha, a BJP MP from in the Lok Sabha has introduced a private members bill. and he introduced a bill called Population Regulation Bill, so PR Bill 2019. So he introduced a bill called the Population Regulation Bill. This bill advocated incentives to those adopting the small family practice and proposed penalties for those who don't adhere to the norm of a small family. So he introduced a bill which calls for providing incentives to small families. So first of all, what is a private member? What is a private member's bill? So I'll just read what I have written here. So BJP Lok Sabha MP in November 2019 introduced a private members bill seeking to enforce a two-child norm. The Population Regulation Bill 2019 advocated giving incentives to those adopting the small family practice and penalties for those who didn't. So this bill proposes to incentivize those who have adopted a two-child norm and penalties for those who didn't. So who is a private member? So it is written here, an MP. So a member of parliament who is not a minister is a private member. So this is something which is important. It can be asked in the prelims examination. A member of parliament who is not a minister is a private member. So a private member can be both from the ruling party as well as the opposition. Bills introduced by these members, that is, bills introduced by private members, are referred to as private members' bills, and those introduced by ministers are called government bills. So, a member of parliament who is not a minister is a private member. Bills introduced by private members are referred to as private members' bills, and those introduced by ministers are called government bills. Government bills are backed by government and also reflect its legislative agenda. The admissibility, so bills introduced by private members are called private members bills, whereas bills introduced by government are called government bills. However, in order to be admitted, the private members bill must be approved by the presiding officer. The admissibility of a private member bill is decided by the chairman in the case of the Rajya Sabha and the speaker in the case of the Lok Sabha. It is not that any private member can introduce his bill at any point of time in either house of the parliament. So it must be approved by the presiding officer of the house. Before the bill can be listed for introduction, the member must give at least a month's notice. So at least 1 month notice must be served to the speaker or the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, because this 1 month will be used for scrutinizing the bill to check whether it is compliant with the constitutional provisions and rules on legislation. So before the bill can be listed for introduction, the member must give at least a month's notice for the House Secretariat to examine it for compliance with constitutional provisions and rules on legislation. While a government bill can be introduced and discussed on any day, a private member's bill can be introduced and discussed only on Fridays. This is very, very important. So private members' bills are discussed only in the afternoon session, if I am not wrong, on Fridays. So government bills can be discussed on any day, but private members' bills can be discussed only on Fridays. So this is something which you need to remember. Has there any private members' bill that has been passed? So has a private members' bill ever become a law? So as per PRS legislative research, no private members' bill has been passed by Parliament since 1970. So since the last 50 years, no private members' bill was passed. This is a very important point. No private members' bill has been passed since the last 50 years. However, to date, as on today, 14 private members' bills have been passed. Most of them have been passed in the year 1956. So to date, Parliament has passed 14 such bills, 6 of them in the year 1956. In the 14th Lok Sabha, of the over 300 private members' bills introduced, roughly 4% were discussed, the remaining 96% lapsed without a single dialogue. So in the 14th Lok Sabha, so this is something which is important. So in the 14th Lok Sabha, of the over 300 private members' bills introduced, roughly 4% were discussed and the remaining 96% lapsed without a single dialogue. So most of the private members' bills that are introduced in either house of the parliament end up without having a discussion. Only 4% of these bills are discussed and most of them are not passed. The selection of the bills for discussion, this is also important. The selection, which bill should be discussed on Fridays. So not every bill that has been introduced will be discussed. The selection is done through ballot. So it is done through a ballot. So whichever bill gets selected in the ballot will be discussed in either house of the sorry, in the house in which it was introduced. So in 2015, Rajya Sabha passed the Rights of Transgender Persons Bill 2014, a private members bill piloted by Tiruchi Siva of the DMK. So the last time a house has passed a private members bill is the Right of Transgender Persons Bill 2014. The bill, however, is pending in the Lok Sabha. So it is now pending in the Lok Sabha. So this is the private members bill. So you can be asked questions on who is a private member, what are private members bills, how are they introduced, and what are the statistics as far as private members bills are concerned. So this is a very small topic but important for your examination. So let us move on to the next topic. The next topic is very important for the civil services prelims examination. I am expecting one question in the prelims this year on GST Council, that is the Goods and Services Tax Council. First of all, you must know why this topic is in the news. So in December 2019, the GST Council decided an issue by means of an voting. So for the first time in 38 meetings, they have decided an issue by voting. Till that time, that is till the first 37 meetings, all issues have been decided by consensus. Whereas in the 38th meeting, an issue has been decided by voting. So this has created news of sorts, and that is the reason why I think this topic is important for this year's examination. So let me read what I have written here. So breaking from tradition. So breaking from its tradition, Goods and Services Tax Council (GST Council), the governing body that takes all GST related decisions, for the first time in December 2019, resorted to voting to arrive at a decision on uniform tax rate on lottery. So this voting has taken place to come to a decision on this particular issue of having a uniform tax rate on lotteries. So whether we should have a uniform tax rate on lotteries or not was decided in this voting. After voting, the council has decided that after the voting, the GST Council decided that tax on state-run lotteries and state-authorized lotteries would attract a uniform rate of 28%. So after the voting, it has been decided that all lotteries will attract a GST of 28%. So that is what happened. So before the voting, some states, especially Kerala and West Bengal, did not want a uniform voting for state-run lotteries and state approved or authorized lotteries and private lotteries. So in the state of Kerala or in all other states, the rate of GST on state authorized and private run lotteries was 28%, whereas the state run lotteries attracted a GST of 12%. So there was a discussion in the GST Council to have a uniform GST rate on all the lotteries, whether it is state run or private run, etc. So it was the point on which the GST Council has voted, and this is for the first time that GST Council has voted. So this is the reason why it is very important. So the council decided to set the GST rate on all lotteries at 28%. Lotteries run by the state governments were taxed at 12%. So earlier they were charged 12% GST, while those authorized by the states and operated by private players, those authorized by states and operated by private players as well as interstate suppliers of lotteries are taxed at 28%. So those authorized by states and those operated by private players attracted a tax of 28%. The decision was favored. So to have a uniform rate of GST was favored by 21 states, and 7 states have opposed this move and 3 have abstained. So 3 states have abstained. And since 21 states have approved this, it has been cleared. So this is the first time in the history of GST Council meetings that a decision was taken by voting. So that is the reason why it is important. So the effective rate of GST of 28% on all taxes became applicable on the 1st of March. So first of all, you need to know something about the GST Council also. So GST Council is a constitutional body. So this is a body that is mentioned in the Constitution of India under 279A. So this is very important. So Article 279A of the Constitution of India deals with GST Council. GST Council is a constitutional body for making recommendations to the union and state government on issues related to goods and services tax. The GST Council is chaired by Union Finance Minister and other members of the Union the Union State Minister of Revenue or Finance and the ministers in charge of finance or taxation of all states. So GST Council is comprised of the Union Finance Minister who acts as the chairman. It also includes the Minister of State of the Finance Ministry, and it also includes every state minister in charge of finance in every state. So these are the constitutional provisions with respect to GST. The President, GST Council, the President shall within 60 days from the date of commencement of the Constitution constitute a council called the GST Council. So immediately after the GST Act has entered into force, the President must create the GST Council. GST Council comprises of the Union Finance Minister as the chairperson, plus the Union Minister of State. So there will be a Minister of State in the Finance Ministry, plus all ministers at the state level who are in charge of the finance portfolio. So GST Council shall consist of the following members: the Union Finance Minister who acts as the chairperson, the Union Minister of State in charge of revenue or finance, that is acting as a member, the Minister in charge of finance or taxation, or any other minister nominated by each state government as members. The members of the GST Council shall choose from among themselves any person who acts as the vice chairperson. As I have already told you, the chairperson is the Union Finance Minister. The vice chairperson, however, will be chosen by the members of the GST Council from amongst themselves. GST Council performs a wide range of functions, so they make recommendations to the Union and the states on the following issues. So the taxes, cesses and surcharges levied by the Union, the states and the local governments which may be subsumed in the GST. So what taxes, cesses and surcharges must be absorbed within the GST fold will be recommended by the GST Council. Further, the GST, the goods and services that may be subjected to and exempted from the GST. So what goods shall attract GST and what goods shall be exempted from GST will be recommended by the GST Council. Model GST laws, principles of levy, apportionment of goods and services tax levied on supplies in the course of interstate commerce or trade under Article 269, and the principles that govern the place of supply. So various other related issues related to interstate trade and commerce. Then the threshold limit of turnover below which the goods and services may be exempted from GST. So the threshold limit of turnover below which goods and services may be exempted from GST. The rates including floor rates with bands of goods and services tax. Any special rate or rates for a specified period to raise additional resources during any natural calamity or disaster. This is very important. So GST Council can also authorize a special calamity tax. In fact, Kerala has become the first state to impose a calamity tax. It imposed, I think, the calamity tax in 2019 in the month of April. So this is very important. Kerala is at present the only state which has an additional 1% GST on calamities. I mean on all goods that are sold in Kerala. This tax is called the calamity tax. Then special provision with respect to the states of Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Jammu and Kashmir, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, Tripura, Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. So special provision with respect to the states. So there are some special provisions given to these states and these will be decided by the GST Council. Any other matter relating to goods and services tax as the council may decide. The Goods and Services Tax Council, GST Council, shall recommend the date on which GST shall be levied on petroleum crude, high-speed diesel, motor spirit, natural gas and aviation turbine fuel. This is very, very important. So GST Council will determine the date and date on which diesel, petroleum crude, natural gas and aviation turbine fuel will fall under the purview of the GST Council. While discharging the functions conferred by this article, the GST Council shall be guided by the need for a harmonized structure of goods and services tax and for the development of a harmonized national market for goods and services. So they should always keep this in mind. So this purpose, the very purpose of introducing GST is to create a harmonized national market for goods and services. One half of the total number of members of the GST Council shall constitute quorum at its meeting. So what is a quorum for GST meetings? That is 50% or one half. Then the GST Council shall determine the procedure in the performance of its functions. So what is the procedure that should be adopted in the performance of its functions. Every decision of the GST Council shall be taken by a meeting by a majority of not less than three-fourths of the weighted votes of the members present and voting in accordance with the following principles. So this is very very important. GST Council decides uh, any issue by means of voting. So if there is no consensus, then it is decided by voting, and in the voting, 75% of the votes polled on the basis of weightage must give the approval or disapproval for a particular project. Every decision of the GST Council shall be taken at a meeting by a decision by a majority of not less than three-fourths of the weighted votes of the members present and voting in accordance with the following principles, namely, the vote of the central government shall have a weightage of one-third of the total votes cast. What is the percentage of votings, or what is the weightage given to the central government? So, in the GST Council votings, one-third of the weightage is given to central governments. The votes of all states together shall be taken as two-thirds. So, all states together account for two-thirds of the total weightage of the GST Council voting. This is very very important. So, decisions are taken by a majority of not less than 75% of the weighted votes, and the weightage of the central government is one-third and the weightage of the state governments is two-thirds. So this is about the GST Council. So let us talk about the Afghanistan peace deal. This is a very important topic for your examination. So finally a peace deal was concluded in the month of February. So in February 2020, that is on February 29, 2020, the United States of America signed a landmark peace deal with the Taliban, and this aims at ending the war on terror, which was launched by the United States of America on Afghanistan. So this war was launched by the United States of America in the year 2000 following the 9/11 attacks, and this war has not ended since then. Initially, Taliban were on the back foot, but soon they became a very powerful insurgency movement. And as of now, it is said that 70% of Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban. So the United States of America and its President Donald Trump have made a promise. Donald Trump, in fact, has made a promise during his election campaign that he will bring troops out of the foreign countries, and he has delivered on this particular promise very recently. So, what do you mean by the Afghanistan peace deal, and what are the various features of this particular peace deal which was signed by the US government with Taliban? So, this is very important. This question can also be asked in the mains examination. So, after more than 18 years of war in Afghanistan, the United States and the Taliban, so the United States and the Taliban reached an agreement on February 29, 2020. The provisions of the deal include withdrawal of all American and NATO troops from Afghanistan. So, this deal was signed on February 29, 2020. So, what are the features of this deal? So, this is very important. The provisions of the deal include withdrawal of all American and NATO troops from Afghanistan. A Taliban pledge to prevent Al Qaeda from operating in areas under Taliban control, and talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. So, there are three prominent issues here. So, the first and the most important feature of this deal is that USA will withdraw from Afghanistan, and they will withdraw within 14 months. So, they have set a deadline of 14 months, and in the next 14 months they will withdraw. Taliban has also stated that they will not support or give shelter to Al Qaeda in areas that are under the control of Taliban. So this is what happened in 2001 when Taliban came to power in Afghanistan. They gave shelter to Al Qaeda, and it is from Afghanistan that Al Qaeda started carrying out a number of terrorist attacks. So Taliban has promised to the United States of America that it will not give shelter to Al Qaeda to operate in areas under their control. And then what should be the future of Afghanistan will be decided by the talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. So what should be the future setup in Afghanistan will be decided by talks between Afghanistan and Taliban. This is something which is very very important. The United States agreed to an initial reduction of its force level from 13,000 to 8,600 by July 2020. They have already done it. So they have reduced their force strength from 13,000 to 8,600, followed by full withdrawal within 14 months if the Taliban keeps its commitment. So if the Taliban keeps its side of the pledge, then they will withdraw completely from Afghanistan. What else are the features? The United States of America has also committed to closing 5 military bases within 135 days and expressed its intent to end economic sanctions on the Taliban. So the military bases of USA in Taliban in Afghanistan will be closed down, and the economic sanctions that have been imposed on Taliban will also be lifted. The deal also includes a prisoner swap. This is very important, and this is the reason why the talks have not yet started. They will be starting very soon. So the deal also provides for a prisoner swap. Some 5,000 Taliban prisoners, so 5,000 Taliban prisoners and 1,000 Afghan security force persons. So some 5,000 Taliban prisoners and 1,000 Afghan security force prisoners would be exchanged by 10th March when talks between Taliban and the Afghan government are due to start. So 5,000 Taliban prisoners will be exchanged for 1,000 Afghan soldiers by March 10th. So this was supposed to happen by March 10th, but this did not happen as the Afghan government was very reluctant to release hardcore Taliban prisoners. So the deal also provides for a prisoner swap. Some 5,000 Taliban prisoners and 1,000 Afghan security force prisoners would be exchanged by 10th March when the talks between Taliban and Afghanistan government are due to start. They were supposed to start on March 10th. However, they have not started so far. Afghan officials have said that they released as many as 4,500, 4,400 prisoners, but the government has refused to release the last batch of around 600 inmates, describing them as too dangerous and insisting some foreign governments also want them to remain in jails. So they have initially released 4,400 prisoners, but the last batch of 600 prisoners were not released by Afghanistan, and Afghanistan government insists that these are too dangerous people. These people are very dangerous, and some foreign governments also want them to be in jail. Finally, President Ghani. So very recently, a development has taken place with respect to this. So finally, President Ashraf Ghani decided to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. So as promised under the deal, 5,000 Taliban prisoners will be released. And this announcement has been followed by a ceasefire announcement by Taliban. So Taliban on the eve of Eid al-Adha has announced a ceasefire agreement. This is just the third time in the history of the 19-year-old war that they have announced a ceasefire agreement. The Taliban said on 28 July, so very recently, that they would observe a 3-day ceasefire this week during the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha, as Afghanistan's president suggested the long delayed talks between his government and the insurgents over ending the war could start in a week. So they will be starting anytime now. So this is what has happened very recently with respect to prisoner swap. The developments promise to inject new optimism into the peace process that was floundering with disagreements over prisoner swap and increased insurgent attacks, even as USA continues to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Taliban has criticized the government of Afghanistan for creating hurdles in the way of the intra-Afghan talks by not releasing the remaining prisoners. The completion of prisoner exchange process was one of the most fundamental issues of the Afghan peace process, according to the Taliban. You know the background of the war, but anyways, I have written something here about the background of the Afghan war. It began when the US launched airstrikes 1 month following the 11th September 2001 attacks, and after the Taliban has refused to hand over men behind the September 11 attacks, especially Osama bin Laden. The US was joined by an international coalition and the Taliban was quickly removed from power. So USA launched the war on terror and they have forced Taliban to leave power in Afghanistan. However, they turned into an insurgent force and continued deadly attacks, destabilizing subsequent Afghan governments. So they emerged as a very powerful insurgent organization and they carried out deadly attacks on American and Afghan forces. This destabilized the subsequent Afghan governments. The international coalition ended in combat mission. The international coalition ended its combat mission in 2014, staying only to train Afghan forces. So the international forces are no longer involved in combat missions. They are now engaged only in training the Afghan military personnel. But the US continued its own scaled back combat operation, including airstrikes. The Taliban has, however, continued to gain momentum, and in 2018, the BBC found that they were active across 70% of Afghanistan. As we have already discussed, 70% of Afghanistan is still under the control of Taliban. So, what is the analysis of this particular peace deal which has been signed between the United States of America and Taliban? So, experts suggest or experts stress that the deal between US President Donald J. Trump's administration and the Taliban leadership is only the first step to achieving lasting peace. So, this is just the first step to achieving lasting peace. The bigger challenge, they say, will be negotiating an agreement between Islamist fundamentalist group, that is Taliban, and the Afghan government on Afghan's future. The biggest challenge, however, is with respect to the intra-Afghan talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. We'll have to see what kind of a setup emerges after these talks. Many Afghans, exhausted by a war that has killed thousands of people and forced millions to flee as refugees, fear that a US withdrawal could spark new conflict and eventually allow the Taliban to regain control. So many fear that once the US leaves, the Taliban will regain control and they will impose their harsh rule, which actually was criticized significantly. They ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, and during this period, they have subjected the common people of Afghanistan to untold misery. The historic deal has been years in the making, as all sides kept seeking advantage on the battlefield. The agreement is born out of America's determination to bring troops home and recognition, at least by some Taliban, that talks are the best route to return to Kabul. It's a significant step forward despite deep uncertainty and skepticism over where it will lead. When the only alternative is ending war, many Afghans seems ready. Many Afghans seem ready to take this risk for peace. So this is what is the analysis of the Afghanistan peace deal. Taliban leaders, however, say that they have changed since their harsh rule of the 1990s, still seared in the memory of many and most of all Afghan women. This process will test the Taliban, but also veteran Afghan leaders of the past and a new generation which has come of age in the last 2 decades and is hoping against hope for a better future or for a different future. So we'll have to wait and see what emerges out of these historic talks, which will be initiated very soon between the Afghanistan government and Taliban. We hope these talks lead to a democratic government with a constitution of Afghanistan, and we hope that all sides set aside their differences and promote the future development of Afghanistan. So this is about the Afghan peace deal. So we will move on to the next topic. The next topic for today's class will be the United Nations 1267 Sanctions Committee. So what is this United Nations 1267 Sanctions Committee and what is the significance of this particular committee? So very recently, a person belonging to Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan terror group was designated as a global terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. What does this designation mean? And what happens if a person or an organization is designated as a global terrorist or a terrorist organization respectively? India also wanted a person called Masood Azhar to be designated as a terrorist. India has brought the issue of Masood Azhar several times before the United Nations Security Council, and finally he was designated as a security terrorist, global terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. But what entails this designation? So we will look at this committee and what happens if a person is designated as an international terrorist. So the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan terror group's Noor Wali Mahsood. So the latest person to be designated as a terrorist by the UN 1267 committee is Noor Wali Mahsood. He is the leader of Tehreek-e-Taliban (TTP) Pakistan. So the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan terror group's Noor Wali Mahsood has been designated as a global terrorist by the United Nations for participating in financing, planning, and perpetrating attacks on behalf of and in support of entities associated with the Al Qaeda. So, since he supported Al Qaeda, he has been designated as a terrorist by the United Nations 1267 Sanctions Committee. The United Nations Security Council's 1267 ISIL and Al Qaeda Sanctions Committee added Masood 42 to his age is 42 to the ISIL and Al Qaeda sanction list, subjecting the Pakistani national to an asset freeze, travel ban, and arms embargo. So, these three things happen when a person is designated as a terrorist. We will look in detail about these things a bit later. So in June 2018, Mahsood was named the head of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan after the death of Maulana Fazlullah. So in June 2018, this person assumed the Noor Wali Mahsood assumed the leadership of TTP following the death of Maulana Fazlullah. The TTP itself was a blacklisted organization. TTP, that Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan itself, was designated as a terrorist organization way back in the year 2011 for its association with Al Qaeda. So they were associated with Al Qaeda and they have been designated as a terrorist organization. But now their leader Noor Wali Masood has been designated as a global terrorist. So now we will have to look at the Indian context. So there is something similar which has happened in 2019 with respect to India. So in a huge diplomatic win for India, United Nations in 2019 designated Masood Azhar as a global terrorist after China lifted its hold on a proposal to blacklist the Pakistan-based Jaish-e-Mohammed chief a decade after India approached the world body for the first time on the issue. So this is very, very important. So in May 2019, China has lifted its technical hold on designating Masood Azhar as a global terrorist, and this brings an end to an effort which lasted for 10 years by India to bring or designate this person Masood Azhar as a terrorist. Masood Azhar is the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and this organization is involved in a number of terrorist attacks that are carried out in India, the most recent being the Pulwama attack. Pulwama attack is also said to have been carried out by Jaish-e-Mohammed. And the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed, that is Masood Azhar, who happens to have been released by India, unfortunately, in 1999. So this person is wanted by our country. So this person is in the India's most wanted list. India wanted this person to be designated as a terrorist, and the United Nations Security Council obliged India's request after 10 years. But why was India so keen of getting Azhar designated by the Security Council Sanctions Committee? What happens when the committee designates someone as a terrorist? So this is the important issue which needs to be discussed. What will happen if a person is designated as an international terrorist? The Sanctions Committee, so first of all, we need to know when was this Sanction Committee established. The Sanctions Committee of the United Nations Security Council was established under Resolution 1267 in 1999, which imposed limited sanctions on the Taliban. So this is a committee which was established in the year 1999. So that is the reason why it is called the United Nations 1267 Committee, because 1267 is the number of the resolution which resulted in the establishment of this Sanctions Committee. The Sanctions Committee of the United Nations Security Council was established under Resolution 1267, that is 1267 resolution in 1999, which imposed limited sanctions on the Taliban. Over time, the sanctions regime has evolved to include a lot of measures against designated individuals and entities. So, over a period of time, sanctions regime has evolved to include a number of measures against designated individuals and entities. So, initially, limited sanctions were imposed on persons on this list, but over a period of time, far more serious sanctions have been imposed on organizations and individuals on this list. So, what happens when a person is designated as a terrorist? So first, assets freeze. So you need to remember these three things, very important for your exam. Assets freeze. All members of the United Nations are required to freeze without delay the funds and other financial assets or economic resources of designated individuals and entities. So there will be a complete asset freeze. Whatever assets the individual or the organization has in a particular country must be frozen. So which means that he cannot transact, or the organization cannot transact economically or benefit economically using that particular asset. So there will be an asset freeze. All member states of the United Nations are required to freeze without delay the funds and other financial requirements or economic resources of designated individuals and entities. There will be a travel ban. All member states are required to prevent the entry into or transit through their territories by designated individuals. So whoever is designated as a terrorist will not be allowed to enter any country of the world, and no country should allow him to pass through their territory. So he should not pass through a country's territory to a different country. This is very important. So he will be immobilized. So he will not be allowed to move from one place to another place. All member states are required to prevent the entry into or transit through their territories by the designated individuals. Arms embargo. So this is also very important. All member states are required to prevent the direct or indirect supply, sale and transfer from their territories or by their nationals outside their territories or using their flag vessels or aircraft of arms and related material of all types. So the member states are required to prevent the sale of arms and ammunition to organizations designated as terrorist organizations or individuals designated as terrorists, and no sort of assistance must be given to these individuals. So this is a very very important. So there will be three things which will happen if an individual is designated as a terrorist. One is assets freeze, the other is a travel ban, and the third is arms embargo. So that is what happens. So the sanction committee also oversees the implementation of the sanction measures and reports annually to the Security Council on the implementation of this measure. So sanctions committee is also responsible for overseeing the implementation of the sanction measures and reports annually to the Security Council on the implementation of these measures. Azhar's designation. So Masood Azhar was designated as a global terrorist. Azhar's designation as a global terrorist will force Pakistan to act against him and individuals and entities associated with him. This effectively means total immobilization of Azhar and shutdown of his organization and institutions such as terror camps and madrasas. So Azhar's designation leads to complete immobilization of Masood Azhar in Pakistan. He should not be held by Pakistan in any way whatsoever, and no other country must allow Masood Azhar, to travel to their territory or stay in their territory. So since he will be completely immobilized, it is believed that he will not indulge in any terror-related activities by this designation as a global terrorist. So that is what you need to know regarding the United Nations Security Council 1267 Sanctions Committee. Pakistan has proposed the designation of 4 individuals in 2019 under the United Nations Security Council 1267 list. So Pakistan has also made certain requests to the UNSC to designate some 4 individuals belonging to India as global terrorists. So Pakistan made a request in 2019 for designating some Indians as global terrorists in the United Nations 1267 sanction list. These names include Venu Madhav Dongara, Ajay Mistry, Gobind Patnaik, and Angara Appaji. These individuals, according to Pakistan, were financing, supporting, and organizing terrorism inside Pakistan by providing financial, technical, and material support to terrorist groups including the TTP, that is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and Jamaatul Ahrar, that is a splinter group of Taliban and others. So these 4 individuals are accused by Pakistan of supporting terror-related activities inside Pakistan, and that is the reason why Pakistan wanted these people to be designated as terrorists by the UNSC 1267 Sanctions Committee. But this move was not appreciated by the United States of America. USA has put a technical hold on this move, and they wanted more evidence to be submitted by Pakistan. But Pakistan failed to produce this evidence, and since they failed to produce this evidence, the USA has not designated, or the United Nations Security Council has not designated these individuals as international terrorists. So this is a very very important point, so you have to remember these points. So first of all, United Nations 1267 Committee was established in 1999 to impose sanctions on members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The initial mandate was limited, but later the list of sanctions became far more serious. Most recently, Noor Wali Masood of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan was designated as a global terrorist. If anyone is declared as a global terrorist, then 3 things happen. One is an assets freeze, then there is a travel ban, and third, there is an arms embargo. Then we will move on to an organization which is in the news, that is called S&P, Standard & Poor's. So this is a very influential sovereign credit rating agency. So they are in the news because they have given a rating for India. So what is the rating that S&P has given to India? We will also look at the various other issues. So Standard & Poor retained India's sovereign rating at BBB minus, so triple B minus. So you have to just remember this. This is the only question if they ask on this in the prelims. So what is the rating given by a particular sovereign credit rating agency to a particular country? So they will not ask the rating given to the other countries, they will just ask the rating given to India. So S&P has given a rating of triple B minus to India. This is the lowest investment grade level with a stable outlook. So they have given a outlook called stable, and the rating that is given is triple B minus. It said that the economic hit from the coronavirus pandemic will worsen the country's weak financial settings. So S&P has said that coronavirus will have a serious impact on the Indian economy, and that is the reason why the rating is very low, that is triple B minus. But what do you mean by sovereign credit rating? So, however, stable outlook reflects the expectation that the country's economy will recover following the containment of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is some optimism in stable outlook. So there are two outlooks. One is negative outlook and the other is stable outlook. So India has retained the stable outlook, which means that there is a positive chance. So there is optimism prevailing. Then once the COVID-19 pandemic is contained, the Indian economy will soon see higher growth rates. But what do you mean by a sovereign credit rating? So, a sovereign credit rating is defined as follows. A sovereign credit rating is an independent assessment of the creditworthiness of a country or a sovereign entity. So, it is an assessment. So, it is an assessment of the creditworthiness of a country or a sovereign entity. What do you mean by creditworthiness of a country or a sovereign entity? So, assume that I am a customer. My name is X. I want to take a loan from a bank, so assume that I wish to take a loan from State Bank of India. And I apply for a personal loan from a State Bank of India. Will they give a loan for me if I approach the State Bank of India for a personal loan? They may or they may not give a loan, but they will look at some aspects. So they will look at my CIBIL score. So this CIBIL score is nothing but the credit worthiness of X. So the credit worthiness of an individual in India is measured in terms of the CIBIL score. So what is my salary? Have I repaid all the loans which I have taken in the past regularly? Have I defaulted on any loans? What is my track record in repaying my loans? So all this will be taken together and a score will be given to me, and this is called a CIBIL score. And on the basis of the CIBIL score, the bank will give me the loan. If my score is poor, then I will not get a loan. This is called credit worthiness. So every individual will be having some type of a credit worthiness. Similarly, every country will also have a rating. This rating is called sovereign credit rating. A sovereign credit rating is an independent assessment of the credit worthiness of a country or a sovereign entity. Sovereign credit ratings can give investors insights into the level of risk associated with investing in the debt of a particular country, including any political risk. So, sovereign credit rating is taken into consideration if any individual or organization wishes to invest in India. So, assume that there is a big multinational company which wants to come and invest in India. Before investing in India, they will look at our sovereign credit rating. If the sovereign credit rating is good, then they believe that investment in India is not risky. But if the rating is poor, then it means that investment comes with a huge risk. So there is a huge risk on investing in India. So multinational companies always look into this factor before investing in countries. Similarly, if the sovereign credit rating of a particular country is good, they will be in a position to get money from other external markets very easily. So a country which has a good sovereign credit rating agency, a country which has got a very good sovereign credit rating can easily get money from external markets, but a country with poor sovereign credit rating will not be in a position to get money at attractive rates of interest from the external markets. So, a sovereign credit rating is an independent assessment of the creditworthiness of a country or a sovereign entity. So, not just the country, but companies are also rated by these sovereign credit rating agencies. So, sovereign credit rating agency is an independent assessment of the creditworthiness of a country or a sovereign entity. Sovereign credit ratings can give investors insights into the level of risk associated with investing in the debt of a particular country, including any political risk. At the request of a country, a credit rating agency will evaluate its economic and political environment to assign it a rating. So, the economic and political environment in a particular country will be assessed by the sovereign credit rating agencies, and these rating agencies will give a particular rating to a country. Obtaining a good sovereign credit rating is usually essential for developing countries that want access to funding in international bond markets. So, whichever country wishes to have funding from the international bond markets must have a good sovereign credit rating. In addition to issuing bonds in external debt markets, another common motivation for countries to obtain a sovereign credit rating is to attract FDI. So if a country wishes to attract foreign direct investment, then they should have a very good sovereign credit rating. Else, they will be difficult. It will be difficult for countries to attract foreign direct investment. Take the case of Afghanistan. The political environment in Afghanistan is very delicate. The social security is also delicate. There are various issues going on in Afghanistan, which means the sovereign credit rating for Afghanistan will be very low, and this discourages companies from investing in Afghanistan. So many countries seek ratings from the largest and the most prominent credit rating agencies to encourage investor confidence. Standard and Poor, that is S&P, Moody and Fitch are the three influential agencies. So these are the three most influential sovereign credit rating agencies in the world. So you have to remember this point. So these are the three most influential sovereign credit rating agencies in the world. So the rating given by the Fitch agency is triple B negative. So you have to remember the other ratings also. So the rating given by S&P is triple B minus, but the outlook is stable. So rating, sorry. So the rating given by S&P is triple B minus with a stable outlook. What is the rating given by other prominent agencies to India? The rating given by Fitch is triple B minus with negative outlook. So they are pessimistic about the Indian economy. Similarly, Moody has also downgraded their rating for India. They have downgraded it from Baa2 to Baa3 with negative outlook. So these are the three ratings that are given. These keep on changing. Please note the latest rating that is given to India by these prominent rating agencies. Such a question can be asked in the examination. So this is a very important topic for your exam. So please make a note of these things. Okay. So let us move on to the next topic for today's class. This is a table. So S&P has the following types of ratings. So AAA, AA. AAA means the highest rating that a country can get. So which means investments are secure, returns will also be positive. So the economic and social political environment is very good. So AAA, AA, A, triple B, BB, B, triple C, double C and C. So these are the various ratings that are given. And we also have double B, B, triple C, C, D. So, and every rating is qualified or modified by plus and minus. So there are plus as well as minus to show relative standing within the rating categories. So this is about S&P ratings and a very important and useful topic for your examination. Then we will look at the rankings of Indian universities that have been released by QS, that is Quacquarelli Simons. So what is the ranking given to prominent Indian education institutions? So only three institutes from India. So only three institutes from India, that is IIT Bombay, IIT Delhi and IISc, that is the Indian Institute of Science. So IIT Bombay, IISc and IIT Delhi. So these are the three institutions from India which have made to the top 200 list of world universities when they recently released QS World University Ranking. So only three universities or institutions from India are in the top 200 universities list that has been released by Quacquarelli Simons World University Rankings. Institutes from the United States of America and the United Kingdom and one from Switzerland dominate the top 10. So all the top 10 spots are filled by institutions from the United States of America and the United Kingdom. One spot is filled by the institution from Switzerland, that is rank 6. MIT of the United States, so Massachusetts Institute of Technology of the United States took the number 1 spot, followed by Stanford University and Harvard University, taking the second and third rankings. California Institute of Technology took the 4th spot, while UK's Oxford University took the 5th spot. So these are the best universities in the world according to QS World University Rankings. So you can expect a question. QS World University Rankings have decided or ranked Massachusetts Institute of Technology as the number one university in the world. Among the Indian institutions, the IIT Bombay. So IIT Bombay ranks first. The rank of IIT Bombay, sorry, is the rank of IIT Bombay is 172, and it is followed by IISc. IISc is having a rank of 185, and the IIT Delhi. So IIT Delhi has a rank of 193. So these are the best institutions of India according to QS World University Rankings. So these rankings are often used as a reference point by higher education aspirants to choose their university for their choice. So there are various weightages that are assigned to various parameters. You need not follow these weightages. Just for your convenience, I have added this point. And there is a ranking that is given by the Ministry of HRD also. So the Ministry of HRD releases the national version of the best institutions. So what are the best institutions of India according to NIRF rankings? So the Ministry of Human Resource Development released the 2020 National Institutional Ranking Framework for educational institutions in India. So NIRF rankings have been released very recently. So the NIRF is an annual ranking and was launched in 2015. So the ranking of Indian institutions started in the year 2015, and first ranks were released in 2016. So NIRF 2016, NIRF 2020 has ranked institutions across 10 categories. So 10 categories, in 10 categories, NIRF rankings have been released, and in every category we have the best institution in the country that is mentioned here. So these categories are overall category, university, the best overall institution of India, best university of India, best engineering college of India, best management institution, best pharmacy college, best medical college, best law college, architecture, and dental college. So this is the ranking. Okay. Maintaining their last year's position, IIT Madras and IISc Bangalore bagged the first two ranks, followed by IIT Delhi on the third position among educational institutions of the country. So best overall education institution of India is IIT Madras. So according to NIRF, it is IIT Madras that is the best institution of India. But interestingly, in the QS rankings, IIT Bombay is the best institution of India, because the parameters that are used by QS is different from the NIRF parameters. So anyways, this is very important. According to NIRF rankings 2020, the best overall institution of India is IIT Madras. It is best university of India is Indian Institute of Science. Best engineering college of India is IIT Madras. So please go through these slides, very important. So best management institution is IIM Ahmedabad. Jamia Hamdard is the best pharmacy college of India. Then Miranda House is the best college of India. So these are the rankings that are given: pharmacy college, management, engineering, university, overall, etc. So this is about the NIRF ranking. So we will move on to the next topic. So the next topic is FATF. So FATF is an important topic for your exam. So FATF will be the last topic for today's class. So you must know what is FATF, what is the purpose of the Financial Action Task Force, and various related issues. So FATF, what is FATF? Sorry. So FATF is always in the news because of Pakistan. Pakistan has been designated as a safe haven for terrorism by the FATF. So it has been placed in the grey list. So we will look at FATF, when it was established, where are the headquarters of FATF, and what is the mandate of FATF. So the Financial Action Task Force decided to keep Pakistan in the grey list for failing to check the flow of funds to terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. So the reason why Pakistan is placed in the grey list that is maintained by FATF is because it has failed to check the flow of funds to terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. This is very important. The decision to keep Pakistan in the grey list was taken at the Global Terror Financing Watchdog plenary held online because of the coronavirus. So very recently, a meeting of the FATF was held, and it was decided to include or continue Pakistan in the grey list because they have failed to take action on some of the points or some of the issues that were raised before it. The FATF is an organization which was established in the year 1989. So FATF is an intergovernmental organization founded in 1989 on the initiative of G7 to develop policies to combat money laundering. So initially it was developed to combat money laundering. Later the mandate also included terror financing. So FATF is an organization which is responsible for two issues. One is money laundering and the other is terror financing. The objectives of FATF are to set standards and promote effective implementation of legal, regulatory and operational measures for combating money laundering, terrorist financing and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. So the objectives of the FATF are to set standards and promote effective implementation of legal, regulatory and operational measures for combating money laundering, terrorism financing and other related threats to integrity of international financial system. FATF is a policy making body that works to generate necessary political will to bring about national legislative and regulatory reforms in these areas. FATF monitors progress in implementing its recommendations through peer reviews of member countries. So FATF recommends some measures to other countries, and these other countries are expected to include them in their national legislative and regulatory frameworks. And the measures taken are reviewed among themselves by the member countries. So in June 2018, Pakistan was placed in the grey list of FATF and was given a 27-point action plan to implement in order to be taken off that list. So it was placed in the grey list and it was given a 27-point action plan, and if Pakistan successfully implements this action plan, then they will be brought out of this list. But Pakistan could not implement all the points that have been mentioned in that action plan, and that is the reason why it continues to be a part of that grey list. So in October 2019, the watchdog indicted Pakistan for failing to deliver on 22 out of the 27 targets. So they were given 27 targets and they failed to deliver on at least 22 out of the 27 targets. The task force warned Pakistan that it would be blacklisted if it failed to achieve the targets by February 2020. So by February 2020, if they fail to achieve these targets, they will be blacklisted. However, they continue to remain in the grey list. India, which is a member of the global organization, has repeatedly asked Pakistan to take necessary steps to meet international standards in stopping financial crimes. Being on a blacklist of the financial watchdog has the potential to severely cripple and isolate a country financially, which could lead to a downgraded credit rating and denial of loans and development assistance. So being part of the blacklist means that the country's economy will take a severe beating. The financial institutions of a country will also take a severe beating. So being on a blacklist of the financial watchdog has the potential to severely cripple and isolate a country financially, which could lead to a downgraded credit rating and denial of loans and developmental assistance. FATF has two lists. One list is called the blacklist and the other list is called the grey list. These are informal names. You have to remember that blacklist is not the formal name, it is the informal name. The official name of the blacklist is high risk jurisdiction subject to call for action. So high risk jurisdiction subject to a call for action. So there are two countries in this list, that is Iran and North Korea. So only two countries are there in this list. Countries known as non-cooperative territories or countries are put in the blacklist. These countries support terror funding and money laundering. And there is one more list that is called the grey list, jurisdictions under increased monitoring. So this is officially called jurisdictions under increased monitoring. So in the examination you may be asked, instead of grey list, they may also ask you jurisdictions under increased monitoring. Countries that are considered safe haven for supporting terror funding and money laundering are put in the FATF grey list. So countries whichever are considered as safe havens for terrorist financing are placed in this list. This inclusion serves as a warning that they may enter the blacklist. So if they fail to take up measures, they will be entering into the blacklist. You need to remember that as of now there are only two countries in the blacklist, that is Iran and North Korea, and the remaining countries, there are some 15 countries, if I'm not wrong, in the grey list. I have mentioned the list here. So, Pakistan's inclusion, as we have already discussed. So these are the countries that are in the grey list. So please go through this list. It can be asked in the examination. You can see here we have Pakistan, we have Zimbabwe, Yemen, Uganda, Syria, Panama, etc. Okay. So this is the class for today. So if you like the class, please like, comment, and subscribe. So you can call me at this number. Please use this code RRUPSC. So I'm repeating it once again. Please use this code RRUPSC when you subscribe to the learning app. If you want the material, please join this channel, Rajashekara Reddy. Rajashekara space Reddy space UPSC. UPSC is a single word, Reddy is a single word, and Rajashekara is a single word. So you you join this channel and you get the free material. So you get the material here, and if you have any doubts, you can post your questions in this channel. So thanks for listening, and have a good day.